We saw Europe, land and sea. We put them to the test, and everybody wants to know which one we thought was best. Stay tuned and find out. Welcome to my travel window. Our goal is to help you maximize your travel experience. We focus on 4 areas. 1, home exchange, both within our country and internationally. 2, RV travel within the United States. 3, cruising. 4, independent international travel. Today we're going to focus on these last 2, comparing cruising and international travel to see which one might be best for you, using 2 of our trips as an example. So, grab your popcorn and let's dive in. If you watched our last episode, you know that our first trip to Europe was a land-based excursion from London to Salzburg. We show it here. The second was a cruise from Athens to Barcelona. What you may not realize is exactly how similar these trips are. Same people, same geographic region, very close in time, about 15 months apart, exact same length, 18 total days, 16 of those in Europe. This gives us a unique opportunity to compare the 2 trips side by side, both objectively, distance traveled, country seen, places explored, days spent traveling, and subjectively, food, accommodations, interactions, overall advantages. Finally, we'll compare cost and give our individual assessment. So let's dive into the objective measurements. Distance traveled. In order to get this measurement, I used some software called Traveler's Point. And what you can do is, in that software, you can enter an itinerary and show the various stops along the itinerary. When you do cruises, I had to add a couple extra places to show how we went around. But when you get done, what the itinerary will do is calculate your total distance traveled. And when I entered this for our first trip, we traveled approximately 1,250 miles in our first land-based trip. Compare that to the cruise, which was almost exactly 2,500, double. Country seen, first trip, 4. Second trip, 6. Places explored. Now, we went to more cities in each case, but these are places that I actually felt like we spent enough time to get a good taste for what the place is. So, places explored in the first trip, 5. Second trip, 10. Days spent traveling. For the land-based trip, I'm counting the time spent either on trains or in a rental car traveling across Europe. And we spent, in terms of days or half days all added together, about 3 days traveling. On the cruise ship, I'm counting a travel day as what's known as a sea day. In other words, a day in which you're on the ship and you don't actually see anything but open water. Most days the cruise ship travels at night and you spend the day in a port, but on sea days it's just spent in travel. So comparison of the 2, 3 versus 3. Now let's go to some of the subjective things. Food. Let's just say it was variable, ranging from spectacular to forgettable, often enhanced by the setting. We ate dinner in the Eiffel Tower. We dined in a 1,000-year-old castle overlooking Salzburg. We had tea and scones on the English coast overlooking the seashore. We had what's called stolen bread in Bavaria. We had hot lattes in a warm cafe overlooking the Parliament on a cold, rainy London day. The food was a wonderful part of the whole experience. Now, ships, of course, are famous for their food, and more especially for the abundance of their food. It ranged from very good to excellent. It's tough to beat lobster night or having coffee and a croissant on your balcony while you watch the sunrise over the Mediterranean. But while you have a vast array of choices, and it's good, it's less geared to the local cuisine where you are at the time. My judgment, I'd give a slight edge to the land trip, even though there were some failures along the way, just because of the ability to tailor your food to the location that was there. There's something wonderful about going and saying, what is the specialty in your area? I want that. Accommodations. The advantage of a cruise ship is you unpack once and don't mess with luggage for the entire trip. So for that whole trip, we had 3 beds. The hotel when we arrived, the cruise ship for 13 nights, the hotel in Barcelona the night before we departed. On land, we had 7 different accommodations, 1 in each of the 5 cities visited, and 2 overnights while traveling. We stayed in 3 hotels, 2 Airbnbs, and 2 regular B&Bs. Advantage, cruise ship. Interactions. On land, we had scores of interactions with locals, and were amazed at how friendly and helpful the locals were, apart from an irascible but memorable French waiter. In London particularly, we found an incredibly helpful spirit among people. Many places we could get help if we asked for it. London is one of the few places we've traveled where people saw that we needed help without us asking and came and offered to help. It happened on multiple occasions. On ship, we discovered that the majority of our interactions were with other people on the ship and with the crew. That's because you're dining most of your meals with those people, and that's where you're spending a lot of free time when you're not sightseeing. In most cases, these were also different nationalities, but they're fellow tourists instead of locals. In both cases, we came away with at least one set of new friends with whom we continue to correspond 6+ years later. I'd give this a draw. Overall advantages. On land, freedom, flexibility, in-depth local experience. For the sea, comfort, convenience, diversity. Judging that depends on what you're looking for. So here's the way I recommend you look at cost. Break it down into categories. Airfare is always going to fluctuate depending on the time of year. I think it's important to break these out because this is an area where you can use frequent flyer miles or use other means of getting a cheaper trip. Fundamentally, the trips to these 2 places were the same amount of money. When we traveled on this trip, we were budgeting $150 a day for housing expenses. I told you we stayed in several different hotels, Airbnbs, bed and breakfasts. We were staying in locations that were fairly pricey, London in particular. And but we stayed within that budget. We also budgeted for food and entertainment, $150 a day. We stayed within that budget as well. So altogether, we were spending $300 a day. Now, if you look over at the cruise ship bundles those together. You have your housing, your food, and your entertainment all in one package deal. And it worked out that was $300 a day. The 3 days that we spent in the hotel prior to going on the cruise, we budgeted the same as we had the year before. So essentially, in housing, food, and entertainment, these 2 are a wash. Now what you have is intra-Europe travel. In other words, getting from east to west or west to east. In the land trip, you're actually paying for planes, trains, and automobiles. We used all of those to get from one place to another, and we spent altogether about $1,000 on that process. Conversely, when you're on the cruise ship, excursions, those trips that you take once you get into port and need a guide or someone to take you to Ephesus, for example, or on a tour of Rome, or on a tour of Cinque Terre, all of those were excursions. And we spent a similar amount of money for those as we did for the planes, trains, and automobiles. So that's pretty much a wash. The last item was special events. On our land trip, we had our anniversary dinner on the Eiffel Tower. Of course, that's an unusual event. And the bottom line is the land trip was more than the cruise by essentially that amount. Since these two trips, we have planned other sea trips and other land trips. While costs are similar, on later trips we actually spend slightly more per day on a sea cruise, but they're still very similar in cost. And I wouldn't say that cost is the overriding factor in the grand scheme of things. So what's my final assessment? When comparing the two kinds of travel, what you're really looking at is narrow and deep, the land trip, versus shallow and wide, the sea trip. If I had to choose only one trip, I'd probably take the land trip, because to me, I would rather have the depth of local experience. But if I could choose two trips, what I would do is take one of each rather than two of either one. What I would rather do is take the sea trip and do exploration, deciding where I wanted to go back and spend more time and go more deeply, and I'd use the land trip to make that happen. We did that exactly with Rome and Cinque Terre. From this very first trip, we spent a day each in those two areas, then decided we wanted to come back, and we wound up spending a week in each of those places on the land trip. There's no comparison between the depth of experience. Let me close with the story behind this picture. Some of my fondest memories of our Mediterranean cruise were the morning sunrises over the sea. When I got home, I realized I had taken 300 pictures of sunrise on the water. 99% of them were beautiful at the time, but are simply forgotten. This one is the exception. This lighthouse was just off the southern coast of France, and the ship was slowly approaching our landing site for the day. Clouds were beautiful, as you can see. The beacon from the lighthouse revolves every few seconds. Although my first picture was nice, I was determined to capture a shot at exactly the moment the light faced my lens, creating the star pattern you see here. Failing time after time, I finally set my camera to burst mode, taking several photos in succession until I captured this scene. It's one of my favorite travel pictures of all time. Until next time, happy travels.